kind of on the downhill slide in First Peter. On the way to the end of the book here, finishing up the fourth chapter. There's only 5 chapters in First Peter, so just got a few more messages left after this one. We should for sure be done with First Peter by the end of May, but not sure exactly how many messages I'm going to do in the 5th chapter yet. I'm going to do 2 or maybe 3, so we'll see. But anyway, we're heading there. To the end of the book. And so Peter is beginning to kind of give his final statements in a sense. One of the key themes that maybe you've noticed in this book is that Peter addresses over and over again suffering. And so this passage before us today, at the end of chapter 4, is kind of Peter's final word on suffering in the book of 1 Peter. And he has started with this book, and just kind of overview some of the things he said in this book about suffering so far. First, he said that we need to recognize that God is with us in suffering. That when we are experiencing suffering in this world, that God is there. He hasn't left us. He hasn't, just kind of abandoned us, right? But He is there with us in suffering. Next, he wanted to be clear that we will experience evil in this world. That there's going to be people who are just evil people that are going to come and do evil things to us. And so he wanted to be clear that we knew how to respond to the evil and the persecutions that we will face in this world. And he wanted to make sure that we understood that we are to respond with goodness. That we are to respond with love. And again, the whole point is about responding to evil with good is that we want people to know about Christ. It's an evangelistic perspective that we take in the midst of persecution, that we would continue to respond to evil with good in hopes that they would eventually come and give their life to Him as well. A couple of weeks ago, we saw that Peter told us that, yes, suffering in this world is a reality and that we're going to face it sometimes, and that sometimes God's going to bring us through certain suffering. But Peter said, but there's also times when God gives us a choice. And He says, you know what, there's some things that I want you to choose to suffer. That there's some sufferings in this world that we need to just make the choice that we're going to walk through the door of suffering in order to experience the freedoms that are on the other side. Sometimes we have to choose to suffer. And then last week, we saw that Peter wanted to be clear that in the midst of our suffering, that we would know that not only is God with us as he started out with, but that he would know that God has provided what we need to endure the suffering. That he has provided, first of all, the knowledge of the future, the idea that we know that there's an eternity and that we are going to be in it, that we will be there forever with God, right? And so that when we're in the midst of suffering, we can turn our eyes from this world and focus our eyes on eternity, and knowing that the sufferings that we'll face in this world are limited. And that someday they will end, and we will spend eternity with our Heavenly Father in a perfect condition, perfect world, without sin, without suffering, without pain. Amen. He also wanted us to know that God has given us community. He's given us the family of God, the church. He's given us community to us to support us in it. That we would recognize that we're not alone, certainly because God is with us, but He's also given us flesh and blood people around us who are in this battle with us, that can support us, that can encourage us, that can hold us up in times of trial and difficulty and suffering. And then finally, we saw last week that God has also provided the power that we need to endure. Through just the basic natural talents and abilities that God has given us, that all of us are just naturally gifted with, but also sometimes with supernatural power in order to endure the suffering of this world, in order to live righteously in the midst of all of this evil that surrounds us, that God has given us power to be able to make it through, to do what He calls us to do. So that brings us to today's kind of final mention of suffering in 1 Peter. Where Peter desires to give us, kind of at the end, a kind of an overarching perspective of suffering. That we would be able to have a perspective when we see suffering, not just of what God has done for us or where God is in it, but that we would be able to approach it from this kind of big picture mindset as we endure and engage in suffering. And the interesting thing is that the message that Peter wrote 2,000 years ago for the Gentile Christians in the world at that time, that same message is actually very applicable to us today. Maybe that's not surprising, but it is. It's almost like there were some very similar things going on 2,000 years ago in the culture in regards to suffering as there is in our culture today. And what I mean by that is this. First of all, there is an evangelical perspective of suffering that often looks at suffering as something that is simply bad. That it's all bad, that there's nothing good in suffering. We can see suffering as just being something that, that we just want to avoid at all costs. It can be something that we like, oh man, whenever we suffer, we can start to kind of go, oh man, life is miserable. This is horrible. I don't want to suffer. Why do I have to suffer? And we start asking God, why do I have to suffer? And then sometimes we feel guilty. We're like, oh, well, I must have done something wrong. And we can get the perspective that God is kind of angry God, and he's up there and he's looking down vengefully at us, and you stepped out of line, and so I'm going to smack you a good one here so that you can learn this lesson, right? And so we get this perspective in evangelical circles oftentimes where suffering is just all bad. There's nothing good in it. It's something that we have to endure and we just have to get through. But that is an evangelical perspective, and I think 2,000 years ago, these Gentile Christians had a similar perspective, that suffering was just bad. But what I think Peter calls us to is actually what we see in the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church is obviously where we as Christians, as evangelical church, we came from, right? That was our heritage. For 1,500 years, the Christian church was the Catholic Church, right? And then the Reformation happened, and all these different, denominations kind of created, and part of that was the evangelical, kind of flavor of Christianity. But and you probably, maybe you know a Catholic or two, but when you talk to Catholics about suffering, they have a very different perspective. And their perspective, I think, comes straight from 1 Peter, but also from Scripture in general. And the idea within Catholic thought is that when they suffer, they actually think it's a blessing. They see suffering as something that this is an opportunity for growth. They see suffering as something that, oh my gosh, God is actually, challenging me with this. He's brought this suffering so that I can grow, that I can become a better Christian, so that I can mature in my faith, so I can lean more on God, so I can depend more on Him. That the Catholic perspective of suffering is about intimacy with Christ. They think that if I am suffering, that I'm actually having the opportunity to identify with what Christ endured. That Christ suffered, and that now we get to suffer like Him. Oh man, this is exciting. This is a good thing, right? And so it's a very different perspective, as you can see. Oftentimes, we have the negative view, and as evangelicals, and the Catholics always seem to have this positive perspective of suffering. But I think that this is what Peter is calling us to, a more Catholic, if you will, perspective on suffering. And I think this is what Scripture teaches us about suffering, that the evangelical perspective that many of us have, that suffering is just bad and it's evil and it's something I want to avoid, but if I have to endure it, I endure it and just get through it to the other end. But that we would have not that perspective, but we would gain this new perspective, this beautiful, I think, biblical perspective, it is a blessing to suffer. C.S. Lewis, who was not a Catholic, but he was an Anglican, but had this great quote about suffering, and I think Peter would say, yes, this is what Peter thinks as well. And C.S. Lewis says this: the real problem is not why some pious, humble, believing people suffer, but why some do not. And the perspective here is that, that we should expect as Christians to suffer. That this is just who we are. This is the identity. And where Peter brings us together, I think, in this passage, is Peter is saying that this is part of being in the family of God. The title of this message is Family Pride. And I think Peter is trying to draw this out. That we would not look at suffering as something that is foreign to us, or something that is to be avoided, or something that is just all evil, but that we would look at suffering as just part of what it means to be in the family of God. That this is what we enjoy as a family of God. So let's read our passage today. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 19. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. For it is time for judgment to begin with God's household. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if it is hard for the righteous to be saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? So as I said, I think this is Peter's perspective that we need to bring to suffering, that this is the family. So to start with, we see how to honor the family, or the honor of family. See, this is the idea here is simply this, that, we appreciate what our family has done. Think about our own earthly families, right? We appreciate what our parents have done for us. As we grow up, as kids and teenagers and become adults, when we're young, we usually kind of fight with our parents, and oftentimes we'll think that, I have the worst parents in the world, right? And maybe sometimes we do, but anyway, we grow up with this mindset that, we kind of fight with our parents and don't understand. But then comes a point when you get to be an adult, and my kids aren't there quite yet, that they actually go, oh, wow, actually my parents were pretty smart. They knew what they were doing, and they loved me well, and they did a lot of good things. And so you begin to have an appreciation for what your parents did for you, the sacrifices they made, the things that they gave up in order to raise you and to help you to have, a safe place to live and all of that. And this is certainly the case with my parents. My parents, both of my parents, interestingly, were brought up in horrible home situations. Their parents were not good parents at all. The family lives that they had were just, think of some of the worst things that could happen, and those were some of the things that my parents endured in their families, and their raising their homes. But, and I think this is what drew them together, they both decided that they had seen this ugliness in their own homes, and they said, you know what? I'm not going to continue this. I'm not going to pass this ugliness down to the next generation. I'm going to do something different. And they both agreed together, and they came together and began to have kids in this family, and they were just convinced that, no, we're not going to do what our parents did. We're not going to raise our kids the way they raised us. We're not going to treat our kids the way our parents treated us. And you know how hard that is? It is just naturally, human beings, what we grow up with is what we're comfortable with. That's what we go back to, right? That's our kind of default position. So if you grew up in a dysfunctional home, this is why when you get married later on, you end up having a dysfunctional home oftentimes yourself, because that's where it's comfortable, right? You just kind of fall into that, and this feels comfort. This feels like this is home. This is the way it's supposed to be, right? That's just natural for us to do that. But it's not natural for us to say, you know what I grew up with, yeah, it's comfortable, it's what I'm used to, but it's not healthy. It's not right. I'm going to do something different. That takes a lot of self-discipline. It takes a lot of prayer. It takes a lot of, it's effort. It's not easy. But that's what my parents did. They sacrificed a lot to be able to give me a place where me and my sister could grow up and be loved, and be loved well. One of the things I think my parents are just awesome with is that they were always my cheerleader. Both my sister and I. My sister and I were involved in a whole lot of stuff. From sports to music to all kinds of just academic stuff. We were involved in a lot of stuff. And they were at everything. They just made sure that this was a priority for them. That, my dad would leave work earlier, my mom would leave work earlier, or they'd figure it out some way to be able to make sure that they were at every activity that I did, every game that I was at, every concert that I had. They were there. And it was great as a kid. I played football in high school, and in the town that I grew up, it was a small town, but football was a big deal, right? It's one of those small towns where football was everything, high school football, right? So we had like 1,500 or 2,000 people in the stands, and I'm on the field, and I can hear my mom, right? Okay, everybody else is screaming, but my mom's voice, I can hear, go, Sean, and this kind of thing, right? Awesome, right? To have a mom in the stands cheering for you like that, what a great thing, right? And so I have learned to appreciate what my parents did for me, what they sacrificed, how they raised me, and just the love that they gave me. Even though they didn't have any examples of it in their life growing up, they figured it out and somehow figured out how to love me well. And that was amazing. And so, as my parents begin to age, I'm excited to be able to give back to them some of what they've given me. And I want to be there for them. When they start to not be able to do things on their own, I want to be there to help them. Because they helped me when I couldn't do it on my own, right? And this is the idea of honoring our families, that we would recognize the sacrifices that have been given for us, and that we would seek to give sacrifice back, even if it's just a little bit of what they sacrificed for us, right? It's how we honor our families. In the family of God, it's the same thing. And this is what Peter is calling us to. He's calling us to recognize what God has given for us, what sacrifice He's made for us, that His Son would come and die for us. And so because we appreciate that gift and that sacrifice, we, as part of His family, recognize that when we suffer, it's just our opportunity to give a little bit back to Him for what He has done for us. That it's an opportunity for us to say, I got to suffer for Christ. I got to give a little, I got to sacrifice a little bit just to give back a little bit to what God has done for me. This is the disciples' perspective. Acts 5:41. The apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. This is the family perspective in suffering. This is the honor that it is to be in the family of God. That we would have the opportunity to give back a little bit of what Christ has given us. Family pride is found in the opportunity to give back, to sacrifice a little bit, because Christ sacrificed a lot. One of the saints in the Catholic Church, St. John of the Cross, he wrote this: whenever anything disagreeable or displeasing happens to you, remember Christ crucified and be silent. This is what he's talking about. Okay, I'm suffering, but Christ was crucified. Right? It's the honor that we have. It's how we show that we're proud to be in the family, is to willingly suffer for Christ. Second, we have family systems. And here is, the family systems is just the idea that, there's certain kind of rules, right, and regulations in a family, right, that this is the way that this family is going to function, right? And so we have, rules that are set up, and then discipline that comes as a result of those rules, right? If you break a rule, then there's, you're going to get, in trouble by your mom or your dad, and there'll be some kind of discipline, some kind of punishment, whether it be in the corner or whatever it may be, right? There's some kind of punishment that comes, but there's boundaries that are set. And the idea behind the disciplines, when your kids are little, right, a lot of discipline has to come, right? There's a lot of things there's a lot of rules and things they got to teach them, right? Because they don't know much yet. But as they get older, the idea is that, there's some rules that change, but it, hopefully gets a little bit easier as they get older, as they start to understand what those rules are, right? You don't have to tell your teenager not to put their hand on, the stove, right, when it's hot, right? Because they kind of already learned that, right? As a kid, you got their hand maybe smacked a little bit by, mom because she was, reaching. You know what I'm saying? So the idea is that discipline, though, is that you continue to work on these people, right? We're trying to continue to raise these kids. And in my family, we certainly had rules. And when I'm talking about family, I'm talking about my family and Debbie and I. And Debbie's not here. Poor Debbie, I miss you. But she's taking Carla, our friend, back to the airport this afternoon. But anyway, in our family, so not the family that my parents that I grew up in, but the family that we raised our kids in, we had certain rules. One of those rules was you had to be a Seahawk fan, right? I mean, it just made sense. And so if, a kid, tried to root for someone other than Seahawks, there was some, certain punishments that came about. And everyone had to have a Seahawk jersey, and so you just wore the Seahawk jersey on Sundays or whatever day the Seahawks were playing. You had to wear the jersey. Anyway, so those are some of those things. We also had, the car seat rule, and if you've only had one kid, you don't get this, right? So I'm sorry, but this illustration makes no sense to you because if you only had one kid. But if you had more than one kid, you understand the car seat rule, because there's always the best seat in the car, right? And so your kids are going to fight over, they just do, right? They fight over who gets to sit in the best seat, whatever best seat that is, right? Sometimes it's, shotgun, that's the best seat. Other times it's somewhere in the back seat, some seat that's, or, if you got a van in the way back, whatever. There's this favorite seat. So we had to come up with a rule because our kids, they'd, like all kids, they'd be fighting over I want to sit in that seat, or he took my seat, or whatever, right? Or all kinds of chaos going with it. So my wife and I just sat down, Debbie and I, and says, okay, we got to come up with a rule. So the rule is this, simply, and it's not rocket science, but we just say the oldest gets to choose. The oldest gets the best seat. So, yeah, you're welcome. Isn't that a great rule? That's a great rule, isn't it, Sophie? I don't know if your parents don't have that rule, I'm sorry. It's abusive. Just get out, right? No, anyway, that was our rule, right? It's just oldest, right? And so the oldest would get to pick whatever seat they thought was the best seat at that time. And then the middle child, we had 3 kids, so the middle child then got to make her decision. And then, of course, poor Olivia, she was the youngest. She got just kind of whatever was left over, right? But anyway, that was the way we dealt with that. But on a more serious note, too, we desired, both Debbie and I desired to raise our kids with being truthful and being loving. That's what we really wanted them to embrace truth and to be truthful people and to love others well. And that's one of the things that we've been, our kids have made a lot of mistakes. And being a parent, it's not easy. And I feel like I was a total failure as a parent, as a dad. But anyway, one of the things that my wife and I, especially over the last few years, have been able to just take a lot of joy in is that we look at our kids and yeah, maybe they've still making bad decisions and stuff, but we see in them a desire to live truthfully and to love others well. And that makes us feel proud. Makes us feel like, yes, that's part of being a Vandemark, right? The idea about this system of family is that we would recognize that discipline comes in the family. The discipline comes from our parents, right? I mean, I didn't discipline other people's kids. I mean, sometimes I wanted to, right? But generally speaking, if it was somebody else's kid, it's like, oh yeah, go ahead and play in the street. But my kid, no, you can't play in the street. What are you doing? Come on, you know what I'm saying? The idea of discipline is that it actually shows that we're legitimate children, that we know which family we're in. My kids know that they're my kids in large part because I disciplined them. That I cared enough about their behavior and how they lived and what they did and the choices they made that I would actually do things that were painful to them at times in order to get them to live rightly, to change their behavior, right? And it's the idea that discipline brings legitimacy. It shows that whose family we're a part of and that we are a part of a family. And the interesting thing, too, is you begin to actually, as a family, the kids begin to talk about how their parents disciplined them later in life, right? And maybe you've done this. My sister and I have done this with my parents. I mean, my dad was totally cool, calm, collected guy, never yelled at us, never got angry I just never saw him angry, except for one time. And it was one time, I'll go through a whole story, but my sister and I we were really late coming back from where we were coming from. This is the age before cell phones, so it can just text somebody, Actually, cell phones make it worse. You realize that? Because now you text your kid, and if they don't respond, you even get more worked up and freaked out, right? I mean, is that true for parents today? I don't know. That's for me. I was like, oh, they're not responding to me. Why are they not responding to me? I went off on my kids several times because they didn't respond to my text message, right? It's like, oh, you gotta answer the phone when I call. Anyway, so we come back a little bit late, and my dad it's an hour past when he thought we should be home, and he had been worrying, right? He thought something had happened. So we opened the door, and we had stairs as you walk in there, and my dad is at the top of the stairs, and he immediately is just like, where have you been? I mean, I was just like, whoa, I'd never seen my dad do that before. I just kind of like this. And my sister, she was the fighter. She was like, what are you doing about there? She's right back at him, right? Anyway, it was hilarious. And we were totally innocent, by the way. So, but we talk about it now, right? We get together as family get-togethers, and we talk about it, right? We laugh about that event, right? And we look back at how Dad, got mad, right? Or we laugh about Mom because Mom always got mad. And so we would laugh about how Mom always got mad, right? Anyway, it was great. It's just kind of fun. It's part of being in the family. Well, that brings us to suffering again in the family of God, because sometimes God does discipline us, right? Sometimes we step outside of the bounds that He desires for us to live and to walk, and we face consequences for that. And sometimes we get so angry at God, right? Oh, God, why are you doing this to me? Why are you? And we know it's like, oh, man, God is disciplining us, right? And so that we would be able to take the perspective when God is disciplining us, when our suffering is coming because of our own poor choices, that we would see it as a good thing. That it's actually God saying, look, you're my child. I care about what you do. I'm not going to just let you go and hurt yourself more. I want you to be protected. I want you to come back and live the way that you're supposed to live, the way that I designed you to live. It shows that God loves us, that He hasn't given up on us. That He hasn't just said, okay, well, fine, you know what? You've done that enough. I'm out. You're on your own. Right? No, we have a God who continues to discipline us. And when we've experienced that discipline and that suffering because we've stepped out of line, that we would recognize that God is still working on us. He still thinks there's hope, that we would come around and begin to live more righteously and to do the things that He desires us to do. Recognize that it's actually an honor to be disciplined by God. Hebrews 12, of course, you guys know this passage, 12, 7, and 8. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as His children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. So can we recognize that when we're suffering, when God is disciplining us, that it proves that we are His child? We find pride in the common family expectations, because the Father treats us the same in sense, right? He has the same kind of rules for us to live by. So it's a common expectation, but also the common experience. That when we get together like this on a Sunday morning, that we can laugh about, remember the time when I kind of stepped out of line and God said, oh, no, you will not be doing that. And we can have that conversation, that commonality, and recognizing that we have the same Father. And He's a good Father. Another saint in the Catholic Church, St. Ignatius of Loyola, he wrote this: If God gives you an abundant harvest of trials, it is a sign of great holiness, which He desires you to attain. What a perspective. What a beautiful perspective. That we see that God is disciplining us in order to bring out greater holiness, greater things that He has for us, greater maturity, greater blessings. All right, finally, family trait. And this simply is talking about, the family resemblance that comes, right? I mean, it's called, the genetic kind of code, right? I mean, you have these genes in you that are passed down, right? And so you look like each other, right? I mean, you have kids, and they generally look like you. I mean, there's some families that they're very strong genetic, code, right? I mean, it's like all of their kids look exactly the same. They all have the chin dimple or something, or they all have the blonde hair and the blue eyes or whatever. Right? Some families it's really evident. My family, it's we had a couple of kind of weird children, and then we had Olivia. And it's like, oh yeah, Olivia, that makes sense. Debbie and I put us together, you get Olivia, right? Sean Jr. and Rose Jr. Like, red hair, where did that come from? I don't know. I guess I got some Irish in me, but sure, whatever. Anyway, so it's just a family resemblance, right? We all have that, and we get to experience that in our lives, right? We also not just look like each other, we oftentimes act like each other, right? We begin to have this, similar, terminology we may use, or just kind of ways of, kind of standing, or ways of walking, or ways of kind of, just way we interact and live in this life. Work oftentimes, right? I followed my dad in the grocery kind of world. He was in grocery for many years, for 20-some years, and I was in grocery for too many years, and moved on from that. But anyway, so we do that, right? We follow our parents, and sometimes where they work, and so that's just part of it. But I think just a couple of illustrations from my own experience is first of all, my son and I we look a lot alike. So I have a picture here. Maybe you've noticed this before, but it might come up at some point. But anyway, there it is. So you can see the resemblance of my son and I, and so just so you know, I'm the one on the left. So I know it's hard to tell, but we got similar hats we're wearing, similar stance, just similar. Just man, look at that jawline, just strong jawline. Anyway, yeah. So we look like each other, right? This is kind of part of being in a family. This is the family resemblance piece, right? But also we have a certain trait that is I haven't found other families that have this trait, but I'm sure there's others out there. And I just got to warn you before I show the next picture that it is a bit graphic. So, some of you may have a hard time looking at it. So if you need to just avert your eyes, that's fine. But it is something that's a reality of the Vandemarks. And we have something that's called the speed toe. And so this is my son's foot on the right and my foot on the left. And you'll notice that the fourth toe over isn't straight, right? It's actually bent a little bit, right? And we both have this toe, and we call it the speed toe. It's what makes us go fast, right? So we can run really fast because of this toe. So I don't know, maybe some other people have, a speed toe, but this is my son and I's speed toe that we have. It's a great, privilege to have that. You can take it off the screen now. Someone's probably gonna. We don't get pedicures either. All right. So anyway, this is part of being in the family. But the idea of these resemblances, these traits, these things that kind of are unique to each family, is it helps to identify us as family, right? When my son and I see our toes, we can. Even if I didn't know he was my son, if somehow we had gotten separated at birth type of thing, right? And then years later we found each other, we could go, wow, look, you got the same toe. Yeah, you're probably my son, right? Or at least, the kind of idea, right? that we recognize that we're a part of the same family, right? And this is what family traits do, and this is what suffering is for us as Christians. This is one of the traits that we have in the family of God, is that we suffer. Now, some of us kind of go, I don't like that. But, even some people like the speed toe. I'm glad my toe isn't crooked, right? But this is what it is, right? This is what we've been given. This is what is common among all of us as Christians. That we would recognize that when we suffer, it just kind of proves once again that, yeah, we are part of the family of God. That this is just kind of what we experience, this is what we do. John 15:18-19. And this is Jesus, and he says, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. If you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. That we would recognize when we suffer evil, when people do evil things to us, that's just part of being the family. This is just one of the traits that we have received from Jesus. We're going to suffer. And it's actually a good thing. If nothing else, it kind of disproves, right? I am part of the family of God. We can take pride in the family resemblance. Mother Teresa said this: suffering is nothing by itself, but suffering shared with the passion of Christ is a wonderful gift, the most beautiful gift, a token of love. Again, that we would suffer like Christ suffered. It makes us feel like we're one, that we're connected with him, that we truly are a legitimate child of God. So may we learn to be proud of the family that we're in. In the midst of suffering, may we not scream and holler. May we not see it as just all evil. But will we recognize the identification with Christ that comes through that? That first of all, that we would be able to give back a little bit of what Christ has given us. That we would be able to accept the discipline as God's way of saying, look, you're still my child. I still love you. I still have hope for you. I'm still developing you. And that when suffering comes from the evil world, that we would just recognize once again that we indeed are in the family of God. May we learn to celebrate these signs that show we're in the family of God.